In my previous episode, I covered the life of Catherine of England, a short-lived daughter of Henry III and Eleanor of Provence, and my viewers were captivated by the story of a royal daughter so well loved. So, for this episode and the following, we shall stay in the loving family of Henry III as I introduce you to his two other daughters. And for my regular viewers, I invite you to take note on this family's love and dynamics for when I cover the daughters of Edward I, because his parenting does not reflect his parents. But now, allow me to introduce Margaret, Queen of Alba, a loved little girl, a miserable girl, and an accidental murderess. And this is her story.
Once upon a time, in history.
Disclaimer: certain events may be open to interpretation, and the motives of certain sources, including contemporary, can be questioned. The recording of history is rife with propaganda and can suffer the curse of personal agenda, miscommunication, error, personal interpretation, and fabrication. This can cause the truth to be obscured or lost, but historians work hard to correct this and present history to the masses in its truth. Debates on truth of dates or events will be included if found. This series should be considered your introduction to the historical figure, and you are encouraged to do your own research and support published historians via purchase of their material. Viewers are discouraged from only consuming information from one source, this channel included, as to broaden views and understanding. Links to sources and further reading material will be in the description. Thank you. In mid-1240, Eleanor of Provence would know that her prayers had been answered, as she would have experienced the quickening, the first time a mother feels her child move in the womb. In her time, this was the precise moment that she knew for sure that she was pregnant. And this would have been a delight, for although she had birthed the child just 1 year previously, it had come after years of many, including chronicler Matthew Paris, speculating that she was barren. To be about to birth another child would have been a relief for her, as well as her husband Henry. Eleanor is said to have been in Gascony when she was in the midst of a possibly difficult labour, and called upon the patron saint of pregnancy, Saint Margaret of Antioch, for assistance, and her prayers were heard. Meanwhile, Henry III had the great and lesser halls of Westminster Palace filled with the poor to feed, in the hope that this good deed would lead to him having a healthy wife and a healthy child at the end of Eleanor's ordeal. And on the 1st or 2nd of October 1240, Eleanor gave birth to a daughter. She was to be named Margaret, named for the saint and for her maternal aunt Marguerite of France, according to Paris. The arrival of a daughter was no disappointment. In his joy, Henry III granted Eleanor and the baby Margaret 12 ounces of gold each to express his joy. Margaret would not enter the royal nursery and share a household with their elder brother, the toddler Edward, later to be known as Edward I. Instead, she was given her own, evident by a writ ordering for wine for her and her household. In 1244, Henry III met Alexander II of Scotland in Newcastle to discuss the continuation of peace between their two realms. Alexander had previously been married to Margaret's aunt, Joan of Scotland, who had passed away 6 years previously. Looking for a new method of alliance, it was agreed that Margaret would marry Alexander's son. The betrothal would be official in the same year, but the marriage would not commence until the 26th of December 1251, by which time King Alexander II of Scotland had passed away, and his heir had been reigning as Alexander III for 2.5 years. Margaret was 11 years old and her husband 10. It is possible that the marriage may have been rushed due to the Scottish magnates having concerns towards the king's councillors, as suggested by the Chronicle of Melrose. Evidence for this is that the magnates would seek legitimisation of the king's sister's daughters, given the suggestion of wanting to make a clear line of succession in the case that something were to happen to Alexander. Due to their age, their marriage took place in front of a papal legate to dispel any issues with their age. As the marriage took place during the Christmas festivities, the cost was great. Henry III planned an elaborate wedding for his daughter to emphasise her status as a king's daughter, but also to do the traditional act of displaying to visitors the luxury and wealth of the English court. The splendorous ceremony and celebration was recorded by chronicler Matthew Paris. According to Carpenter's struggle for mastery, Henry III is also said to have welcomed Alexander III into his family like a new son. The couple would spend the following weeks in York, during which time the children seem to have built a friendship and desired to stay in each other's company. They would not get what they wanted. In January of 1252, the new couple headed to Edinburgh. Henry III arranged for a new household to accompany Margaret to Scotland, and this included Matilda, who was to help Margaret establish her household, and 2 knights, Robert of Norwich, previously the Marshal of the King's household, and Stephen, who were charged with her custody. Once they reached Edinburgh, Margaret and Alexander were split into different residences. Due to their age, the marriage was not to be followed with consummation for some years, and to assure the children abided by this instruction, they were strictly kept apart. In letters written to her parents, little Margaret did not complain only of her distance from her husband, but complained to be suffering mistreatment. It is unclear how precisely she was mistreated. A possible answer could be the matter of her dower lands, which the Scots refused to give her on the account that she was too young to have intercourse, which seems to have been an English legal practice. It is possible that the reason that they didn't want this marriage to be consummated was actually so they didn't have to give her her dower lands, rather than it simply being protection due to their young age. From her complaints, Henry's response to his daughter's unhappiness was to send envoys to retrieve her. The Scots refused to release Margaret in the fear that she would not return. Envoys visited Margaret multiple times and would return to Henry to reiterate her complaints of loneliness. In one case, she claimed to be a prisoner and denied permission to travel. The concerns would remain, and it was in 1255 that Queen Eleanor sent her physician to investigate the state of Margaret. The physician returned to tell the royal parents that their daughter's complexion was pale and that she was depressed. From this meeting, we know that Margaret's marriage had still not been consummated. And this seems likely, as although Margaret was 14 years old and 2 years past the entry level of 12 for intercourse for girls, Alexander was only 13, and for boys, it was thought better to wait until they were 14 years old to consummate a marriage. It was from here that Henry III arranged a meeting with Alexander's Regency Council, and it would come to resolve to Margaret's pleasing. Once Alexander turned 14, the couple would be permitted to consummate their marriage. It was also agreed that the Regency Council would resolve upon Alexander III turning 21, at which time he was to permit Margaret the freedom to travel and would be obliged to show her physical affection. Margaret would travel in this same year, and with her long-missed husband at her side. The pair met with Margaret's parents in Wark on the 7th of September 1255. When Alexander returned to Edinburgh, Margaret stayed a few days longer in England. But it would only be 2 years later that Margaret would need her father to rescue her from her circumstances again, but for very different reasons. Clan Comyn was the most powerful family in Scotland, and grew resentful when King Henry supported a takeover of the Scottish government. By 1257, they saw the influx of foreigners in the realm as a threat and resorted to kidnapping Margaret and Alexander and holding them captive. When Henry III and Alexander's Regency Council joined forces for an intervention with the clan, Margaret and Alexander were released unharmed. Eleanor did experience a joy in this year, as she was delighted to receive a visit from her family member that she hadn't seen for 6 years, and this was her elder brother, Lord Edward, who came to visit along with his new wife, Eleanor of Castile. Due to the travels the family took, it seems they enjoyed a short pilgrimage together. Margaret would also receive a gift from her brother, in the form of an esquire, who would go on to have a tragic end. Although consummation likely took place in 1256, it wasn't until 1261 that Margaret would welcome her first child. Taking advantage of her right for travel, she returned to England for her lying-in late 1260 and would give birth to a daughter on the 28th of February 1261. She named her child after herself. Once Margaret returned to Scotland, she did not return to England until 1274. Over the next 12 years, she would have 2 more children. Alexander was born on the 21st of January 1264, and David followed 8 years later. The Melrose Chronicle records David as being born in the early hours of the 20th of March 1272. But it is claimed that Margaret would be unable to attend her father's funeral at the end of the year due to pregnancy, and a story taking place at Clinclaven Castle in 1273 states that she was recovering from childbirth. The Melrose Chronicle may have made a mistake, there was another child now forgotten, or the reason for Margaret's absence from her father's funeral and the following story's setting is entirely incorrect. Margaret's father, Henry III, passed away in November of 1272.
As previously stated, Margaret could not attend her father's funeral, and of her siblings, only Edmund could attend. The siblings would not be reunited until 1274.
After the birth of David, or in the year following of 1273, Margaret was at Clinclaven Castle. She was strolling the grand gardens with her maidens and esquires when a tragedy occurred. They were walking along the River Tay when the esquire, the same one that her brother had gifted her years before, bent down to the river to wash his hands of clay. As he did so, Margaret told her maidens to push him in. They had laughed at the idea, but it is uncertain whether 1 or 2 carried out Margaret's orders or if Margaret took the jest upon herself. Either way, a force hit the squire in the back. He lost his balance and tumbled into the River Tay. And they had still laughed, thinking it was so funny to watch him struggle and expecting that any minute he'd clamber back up onto the grass. The esquire's servant boy, though, he realised his master was in danger as the heavy current took hold and dragged him away from the river edge. The loyal boy jumped in after his master, eager to be the hero despite his age, only to find that he too was not invulnerable to the river's strength. To the horror of Queen Margaret and those who else bared witness, the esquire and the boy went under. They were found and freed, but no longer breathed. It has been suggested that Margaret may have had a vendetta against the esquire for his involvement in the butchering of her uncle by marriage, Simon de Montfort, 6th Earl of Leicester, but this cannot be confirmed. But it is said by Margaret's confessor that she was greatly upset by the incident. In August of 1274, Margaret's brother Edward, now King of England, returned from crusade for his coronation. Margaret and Alexander would be present for the grand ceremony, and they also brought their 3 children. Also attending was Margaret's mother, her sister Beatrice, and her younger brother Edmund. It was to be the last time that the siblings were all together. Margaret and Alexander stayed in England for 5 weeks, with Edward giving Alexander £175 to cover their stay. Unfortunately, Matthew Paris records that the great joy of Edward's return and the families reuniting turned to great sorrow shortly after. In late 1274 or early 1275, Margaret's health began to decline. The Lanarkos Chronicle records that many abbots and bishops tried to visit her, but she banned all from her chamber with the exception of her Franciscan friar, showing preference for the order. Margaret would pass away on the 26th of February 1275 at Cooper Castle. Her death was met with great grief. Her mother Eleanor suffered twice over, as Beatrice would also pass away a month later. Matthew Paris, in tribute to the sisters, records the ladies were in fact very famous and of most beautiful youth, while Thomas Wicks says both were the most serene. Of Margaret, the Lanarkos Chronicle says that Margaret was a woman of great beauty, purity and humility, and that it was rare for one soul to inhabit all 3 virtues. After Margaret's death, Alexander would not marry for another decade, though according to the Lanarkos Chronicle, he used never to forbear on account of season nor storm, nor for perils of floods or rocky cliffs, but would visit none too creditably, nuns or matrons, virgins or widows as the fancy seized him, sometimes in disguise. Margaret's body was entombed at Dunfermline Abbey. Her youngest son David would join her just 6 years later, when he passed away at age 9. Her eldest son Alexander would join her as well, passing away a week before his 12th birthday in January of 1284. And Alexander III would be entombed with them just 2 years later, after either falling from his horse or off the side of a cliff. Thank you so much, history lovers, for joining me for the life of Margaret of Scotland. Join me in the next episode of Her Stories for the life of her younger sister Beatrice. Until then, when I will see you in another time in history.